Hey Adacrew, so today we're going to be going... Oh, come in. Oh, hey Grace, what's up?
I'm having trouble building my deck.
You are? Well, you're in luck because I have just the video for you. Hey Adacrew, ever struggled to build your own deck or fine-tune one you found on the internet? If so, this is the video for you. Today I'll be sharing 5 tips on how I approach deck building and deck tuning. So let's dive right in. Tip number 1 is to understand the general strategy and theme of the deck. Whether you're building your own or whether you found one online through Eggman events or maybe One Piece top decks, you want to understand what the general theme of the deck is trying to do. And the way we do this oftentimes is understanding the curve or the perfect curve of the deck. If you're newer to the One Piece card game, that's fine. I'll explain what a curve is. So in One Piece card game, you have first player getting 1 Dawn, 3 Dawn, 5 Dawn, and 7 Dawn, and so forth. And then the second player gets 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. And so these are the amount of, for lack of a better term, energy or resource that we can play with. And so when we think about a curve of a deck, we need to see what is our ideal turn 1, turn 2, turn 3 play based off the cards that we have in our deck. If you're building your own, this is generally a guideline or a thought process you want to, or thought exercise rather, that you want to do when you are building that deck. This will help us get enough lower end cards and mid game cards and top end cards because we are accounting for that curve. And so one example I'll go over is the Bonnie deck. So in Bonnie, I do like to go second. And so in my 2 Dawn turn, I like to do some sort of search play, ideally the Bonnie Searcher. And then my turn 2 play at 4 Dawn, I'd like to drop something like an Rouge. And then my turn 3, I like to drop a Basil Hawkins, which costs 6. And so as you can see, I'm perfectly utilizing my maximum Dawn and playing the best card that I can to take advantage of the Dawn that I'm at. And so again, understanding the general theme and strategy of a deck is one of the first tips I will say when you're approaching that deck building process. The other part of that is more than the curve is understanding the strategy you want to employ. So for my Bonnie deck, many times I do want to just set up for my late game because I'm playing a ton of late game boss monsters in that deck. And so a lot of the kit is geared towards searching out my top ends with things like Bonnie and Baby 5, and then stalling out until I can get to those late game plays utilizing Bonnie's defensive leader ability, which allows me to rest a leader or character whenever they're attacking this for 1 Dawn, and utilizing a bunch of awesome blockers in that deck. And so that's generally the strategy that I go for in that deck. And again, it is a broader theme, but this is the type of approach you want to do, at least to give you a general idea of the flavor of the deck. Tip number 2 is to have enough counters. And so generally any given deck should run around 8 to 10 2K counters. Some decks do run more. I would highly advise against running less than 8, but again, you want to run around that range. If you run too many, then your hand could also just be low impact, where you just have all 2K counters but no real plays to make. And so finding the right balance for your deck is very important. And so generally, it will be around the 8 to 10 card count of your 50 card deck. And also another question that I get asked a lot, I got asked this a lot on my Red Purple Kid deck, is why am I running a character searcher over the event searcher, which can search out pretty much everything in my deck? And this is because my character searchers have counter on it. And so an event is dead in hand most of the time unless you have a defensive event, in which case you have to leave some sort of Dawn up or give up a card if it's a 0 cost event. But generally, I do tend to like the searchers with counter on it because, yeah, it's never dead in hand. I can use it to search, but I can also have it in hand to counter out of an attack if I need to. And so there are more than just that reason to run that searcher card, but again, one of the main reasons is that it has counter on it. And so take a look through your deck and make sure there's not too many non-counter cards, right? And so this could be the choice between running in my red purple kid deck again. Someone asked, why am I not running more of the 5-drop no counter rush Luffy? Why did I choose to include 2 of the 6-drop Sanjis that have rush when there's a 5k body on the board? The whole reason is I wanted to run a little bit less non-counter cards while still staying true to the deck theme, which is rush. And so the 6-drop Sanji seemed like a good interim card to satisfy both the theme of the deck while maintaining its defensive capabilities. Tip number 3 is when you are building a deck or testing a deck, I would say play against a large variety of decks, especially the meta ones if you can. And so what I do see some people doing is they'll play a matchup against, say, one meta deck, and they will struggle a bit with it. And so they add cards and overthink about that one particular matchup, leaving their deck overall weaker against the majority of the matchups. And so I do think that there are caveats and exceptions to this. If there is a tier 0 deck, then of course it's okay to fine-tune your deck to just match and play as best as it can against that tier 0 deck, because the probability is you're going to be running into a lot of them. But in OP07 particularly, we are seeing a huge variety of decks that are competitively viable. And so I think in this meta especially, we need to test against a variety of decks to see where the strength, where the weaknesses are, where the gaps in our decks are, and that should give us an idea on how to approach fine-tuning our deck. Tip number 4 is tied to tip number 3, and that is to play a good amount of games before adjusting your deck. A lot of times I'll see players play a game where they'd lose and immediately they're going and editing their deck. While I do think maybe some advanced players can do this and adjust this based off of their experience and whatnot, but I would say for the majority of players, play more games before just going directly to adjusting the card ratios, because what I do see happening is sometimes a player will be running 3 copies of a card, which is actually fine, and that's actually probably the amount that you want to see a card, but they'll immediately ramp it up to 4 because in one given game they low rolled and all those cards that they needed were just at the bottom of the deck. And so card games do have a sense of RNG to them. There will be games where you just don't see the card that you're running, even if you're running it at max copies. It happens, right? And so don't just adjust right away based off of a single data point. Play it out over 10 games, 20 games, however many, and then see, am I consistently not seeing this card enough? Or am I seeing it too much, right? And so maybe upping it to 4 would be a mistake, because in the next game you may see it all 4 copies and you just don't need it and it'll be bricked up in hand. And so there are some other sides to this as well. And so things that you can ask yourself is, can I search the card that I wanted to see? If so, you can argue I can run less copies of it because you can reliably search it. But one of the rules that I kind of run for myself is when I run 3 copies of a card, I expect to see around 0 to 1 per game. And then of course you can high roll and get all 3, right? But when I run 4 copies of a card, I expect to see at least 1 or 2 a game. And so those are kind of the ratios that I have been working with. And this all does change based off of how many searches you run, how much card draw potential you have, and etc., how much life you have as a leader. And so do take that with a grain of salt, right? Those ratios. But for my deck building approach, that's how I approach it. So if you see deck builds that I have on the video, if you're wondering why I run things at a 3 of, most of the time it's because I only want to see like 1 copy per game, and I'm okay with sometimes not seeing that per game too. And so yeah, so that's just tip number 4. Tip number 5, and this is kind of a more controversial one and probably more preference if I think about it, but for me, tip number 5 is definitely consistency is king. And so I personally like to play decks that are a lot more consistent. I would love to run cards at the 3 to 4 of range, opposed to the 1 or 2 of range. But again, if you look at a lot of my deck lists, the lowest I'll probably run of a card is a 2 of, if I want to see it or expect to see it just once or none per game. But for the most part, I do think I like to run more copies of a card, and I just rather run a tighter card pool. So for example, I'd rather run 4 copies of a card rather than run 2 copies of 2 different cards if I can avoid it, right? And so sometimes you can't. Sometimes you need to run certain tech cards for the meta, but in general, where I can be consistent, I like to stay consistent because in a card game, there's so much variance already. Having the highest probability to draw consistent cards allows me to play and remember the matchups and play lines better. And so, again, there is always a counter argument too. I do think some decks do run one-ofs quite well, especially if they can be searched, or if there's something like a Lucci that just needs to mill 1 copy of it to keep using it and recurring it. And so, yeah, take that with a grain of salt. But again, the other argument for this is, or for it rather, is One Piece, until you hit Top Cut, it's a best of 1 format game. And so the more consistent your deck, the better it will be, and the better you'll have outcomes or chances to top in a bigger event. And so this is also why sometimes, like in the beginning of the sets when Yellow was first introduced, it was a hard time topping with Yellow because there were a lot of inconsistencies with the deck. It relied a lot on triggers, and so triggers are like a high rolly but also low rolly game style. And so yeah, I prefer consistent decks over anything. And if you haven't tried running a more consistent deck, I would say try the Bonnie deck, the green Bonnie deck. It's a very, very consistent deck as far as being able to search the pieces you need and running 4 copies of cards that you want to see every game. And so, yeah, it'll help you see what it's like to run a consistent deck, and maybe that's for you too. And so, try it out. And yeah, that's number 5. And as per usual, I do have a bonus tip for us today, and that is to try everything. Just because someone says a card is bad, or just because you haven't seen a card show up on some of these deck list sites that we're using to as a foundation for deck building, doesn't mean that those cards aren't good and necessarily that there's no space for it in the meta. I will say, try it out. I think that there are a ton of cards and a ton of decks out there that may be viable but just underdeveloped, or just not enough people cooking with it. And so just because you're not seeing it doesn't necessarily mean that it's not a good card and that it's unplayable whatsoever. And so one of the people that inspires me the most and that really taps into this is Justin Tolman. He's a player in the European region, but that guy is always cooking with cards that I just don't typically see in other decks, and he does well with them, right? And so even back in like the 03, 04 meta, he was using Smoker and using Great Eruption before Great Eruption was considered a good card. And he was even playing with like starter Black Luffy, and that's what inspired me to play Black Luffy as well, which I was able to top with. And so yeah, like just because, and that leader was just way overlooked too during that meta. And so just because someone says they're unplayable doesn't necessarily mean it is. And of course there is the caveat of, yeah, there is power creep and there are these other things, but I think that there still are so many cards that are just underexplored. And so Justin Tolman did it again in his regional event for 07. He used Gum Gum Bell in his Black Yellow Luffy deck, and I've seen other people run it too, like Jonic from Kaizoku Cards, and it just comes in clutch, right? And so it was a card that was very overlooked in the previous black decks because it makes you take your own life. Although it does -7 cost, which is high. But, you know, something in black yellow Luffy, who wants to take his own life, that card is really good at not only getting rid of a bigger body, but allowing you to go down in life to activate your leader ability. And so things like that, that card was overlooked for a long time. We have a leader that came out, and now that card has much greater value. And so I did hear that in his regionals that card was used 3 or 4 times in critical moments, and yeah, that's what helped him secure some of the games that he played against. And so yeah, just try everything, you know. That's just kind of my tip. And yeah, with that being said, Adakai out. Please, if you like this sort of content, consider subscribing, liking, commenting below. It really helps the channel. And also, if you can turn on the bell notification, that would really help the channel as well. And so I'm almost at 1,000 subscribers, meaning, wow, if I can hit that before end of July, I will be doing a giveaway. And so please be on the lookout for that. I'll be announcing on YouTube and on Instagram. And so, yeah, with that being said, these are the 5 tips that I have for deck building or deck tuning. Stay tuned. I will have more content releasing next week. And so have a great weekend, everyone. Catch you later.